Have you ever read Time and Again by Jack Finney?
I haven't, no.
It's the whole concept of time travel and where you immerse yourself in a time and then you end up in it. So I just thought, because he was staying in a very old hotel that still looked like it did in the past, to immerse himself in that time period so that he would just end up there.
What a wonderful idea. What a wonderful idea. And it does feel like that, doesn't it, when you are in these places that have not changed a great deal for decades, sometimes, as in this case, even centuries. It feels like you are in another time and place. I mean, there are a lot of places in the UK like that are sort of stuck in little time warps where the general passage of time just does not seem to touch.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was an amazing experience. I feel very good, but a little washed out.
I know it's much later there than it is here.
Oh no, it's fine. I mean, it's we're edging into summertime, so it's basically daylight outside at the moment. It's fine,
I can't remember. Do you all do time change or not?
Oh yes, we do. We do. We're on the English summertime at the moment,
which usually means in Canada.
Sorry, say again.
I was just saying I have a friend who lives in Canada and they do not do the time change.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, sometimes I envy him.
Yeah, it must look very strange from the outside. I mean, there's logic to it, but at the same time, it is a bit of an anachronism, isn't it? There are no candles to save upon now.
Yeah. So...
But no, I'm sorry I couldn't speak to you last time. I don't know what was going on with my internet. It was being very intermittent. And I had a horrible intimation of it cutting out and then losing the whole damn recording,
It's technology for you.
Yeah, definitely is. Definitely is. Fortunately, fingers crossed, Skype seems to be behaving at the moment. So let's... of course, I've said that now, haven't I? And that will... bring it down upon us. So you're out here to talk about your short story collection, of course, Against the Clock. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 3 novellas by 3 different authors, and I have one of the novellas.
Septic, yeah.
Yeah, that is mine. It's the lead novella, and there's also novellas in there by Shane Nelson and Brandon Ford.
But yeah, it was a very interesting read. I mean, stop me if I'm totally wrong here, but channeling King a little bit.
Well, there was a little bit of I think I even threw in like a Cujo reference.
Yeah,
because King does do that. He, especially in his earlier years, got into that trapped sort of storyline sometimes.
Absolutely. I think it's almost like a recurring... I mean, there are lots of recurring King tropes, obviously. I mean, they're basically infamous at this point, but that is definitely one of them. There's a short story, I can't remember what collection it's in, about a guy who's trapped in a portaloo. Oh
yeah, a Very Tight Place. I can't remember which one of those collections it's in either, but yeah, that was a good one too. And,
it's very good. It's just horrible, isn't it? I mean, like, what I find that he tends to go for in those situations, which is something you've definitely gone for in this one, is like the experiential element of it.
Yeah.
So
I can only imagine being trapped in a place like that.
You haven't had an experience like that, then?
No, not like that, no. But anytime I hear a story like that, it always puts me on edge. Sometimes we watch these YouTube videos that are like tragic true story type things.
Oh yes.
And there was one about a kid who was in his SUV and he was trying to reach over the back to get something, and the seat flipped and pinned him.
Oh.
And he was just trapped in the back, pinned by the seat. And I'm like, I just could not begin to imagine the panic that would set in.
Oh, well, it's fundamental, isn't it? And it's not just us. It's like just any living animal on this planet is programmed. It's primed to panic when it can't get out of a place. It's like it's like fear of the dark, isn't it? It's a fundamental horror. And we humans, of course, being creatures of the abstract as well as our animal selves, have elaborated that and mythologized it and turned it into something much deeper and more resonant. I mean, what I liked about this story in particular is it felt like almost like, what if King were queer, you know?
Well, I can't write anything and that doesn't, turn out queer.
Of course.
But because the impetus of the story is loosely based on a real event.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in high school, there was the cheerleaders met at the high school during Christmas break.
Yeah.
One of the cheerleaders went to use the restroom in the band building. The lock was busted. She did get stuck in there. Now, she did not have appendicitis like my character did.
Right.
And she ended up managing to get herself out after a couple of hours because they did leave her there, just like in the story. But I know the stories that she told, after about it was like, for those 2 hours, she was just panic stricken and wondering, like, is she ever going to get out? And she thought, should I be writing a note to my mother? So I'm like, if I took that scenario and added, like the illness, the appendicitis, which sets the ticking time clock, it could be something. But because I am me, I switched the gender of who it happened to a male cheerleader. And I particularly was interested in the fact that because it takes place in the 80s, it takes place in 1988, which, if you look at a lot of the media from that time period, you would think gay people had not existed.
Oh, yeah.
We were not represented in large numbers. So I'm like, I was interested in showing we were there. And, these are the things we were going through so that, just to make the story a little more interesting about more than just the suspense setup.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's it's one of those things that's absolutely essential, isn't it? And it's something as a fellow gay man, when I read stories like this that are redolent of stories that I've read from other writers, but have that queer element that transforms them, that makes them into something else, it resonates in a way that's almost difficult to articulate, It's hard to say what it is. It feels, I mean, we use words like representation and whatnot, which is important, but feels inadequate to me. It's not just that. It is a kind of affirmation. Yeah, you do exist.
Yeah.
And we always have.
A lot of what I write, I think, comes from that because I grew up in the 80s in love with the horror genre, but never seeing somebody I could say that's me. Never seeing like gay representation.
Of course.
So in some ways, a lot of what I write is like I'm telling the stories that I loved to read when I was younger, but I'm adding that queer element to it. I'm in essence writing the kinds of stories I was looking for back then, but couldn't find.
It's interesting, like contemporaneously as well, isn't it, to have characters that are gay and are young as well, so they are technically in one of the most homophobic environments imaginable. And gay men in particular wrestling with the fact that, and only just knowing that they are gay and fearing the term fearing being labeled as that. There's a whole host of tensions there that are really fascinating, but have largely, up until very recently, gone unexplored in horror fiction.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes queer horror so exciting, is because there hasn't been that exploration of that aspect.
Yeah.
And so it's almost wide open, and it can take old ideas and give them almost a new lease on life, because I always say the best queer horror isn't just your standard horror story, but the character is gay instead of straight. Like the character being gay is going to have an effect. It's going to have an effect on how they react to things, how they see things, their perspective, their reactions. So, I always say the character being gay might not be super relevant to the plot, but it's going to be super relevant to the character's personality, which can affect the plot.
Absolutely,
So,
yeah. It's going to almost like pervade, isn't it? It's an element, it's so fundamental that it affects everything around it. It cannot help but do that. I mean, I think we spoke last time about how there is a problematic preconception of representation a lot of the time, which is that you just throw in a gay character or a character who is incidentally gay, and there you go, that's it. That's all you need to do. And it doesn't really work like that. It really doesn't. I mean, I've had conversations with, fellow straight cisgender writers who were surprised when I said to them, well, actually, no, there are fundamentally queer themes and concepts that are very particular to that identity, which can be explored through speculative fiction, which, straight and cisgender writers can explore from their own outside perspective, but you're never going to get it from the horse's mouth. You're never going to get the fundamentals of it because it's not your experience.
And I feel like that's when I see a lot of people start almost complaining. They'll say, oh, this work is too political.
Yes.
And that's usually when, it's just queer writers putting their own experiences and life lessons into a story, because there are things that we encounter that a straight person doesn't.
Exactly.
So that's gonna make its way into our fiction, and that's not, like, to me, like, it's not that I'm trying to be political, it's just that I'm trying to be authentic to the queer experience in the story.
Exactly. And that
it's interesting because in Septic I have two primary queer characters, Carl and Zach. And
love Zach, by the way. Yeah. Zach's kind of my identity point in this one.
Well, I was going to say, I wanted to explore two different perspectives on being a closeted queer teen in the 80s. And Zach represents more my experience.
Yeah.
The one who's kind of readily recognized as being different and is, harassed for that. And almost, I think at one point in the story he says, even though no one, even though everyone suspected, no one knew.
Yeah, he's when he's he's talking to his friend, isn't he, on the in the parade, and he's talking about how he's thinking about how he suspected that she suspected, and also suspected that he suspected that she suspected, which is as good as knowing, I think.
And because I know when I was younger, I went through a whole period of that. I'm like, I kind of know that they know, and I think they know that I know they know, but we don't talk about it. But that was the perspective of the queer kid who almost can't hide it. Yeah. And then with Carl, I wanted to, because I found out later in life that some of the popular kids I went to school with had actually been in the closet.
Oh, I think that's universal, isn't it? For any gay or queer person, that happens. It's a universal experience. You will run into them, and they were the people who you would never have suspected of being gay or queer in any particular way, and you find that they are gay or they're trans or whatever, and it's actually a really wonderful experience.
And I feel like they probably have a completely different perspective in that they have their own pressures and their own reasons for wanting to, for lack of a better word, pass.
Exactly, yeah. Especially Carl, of course, because he is part of that particular subculture within his high school that is innately homophobic, right?
Yeah. So, I thought it would be interesting to explore it from those two, similar things they have going on, but from two entirely different perspectives. And I thought that could make it, even add a little bit more interest to the story.
No, I really like that, actually, because it's that dichotomy, isn't it? It's really clean and crisp within the story, and it provides a very effective dynamic for demonstrating, look, both of these guys are gay, but that is not the entirety of what they are. They are not an archetype or a stereotype.
Yeah. And, that is something that's important to me too, is to, even within the queer community, there is so much diversity.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, it's that old joke, isn't it? There's a joke in Jewish culture. What do you have if you have 10 Jewish people in a room? You have an argument, right? Yeah. It's the same with gay people.
and that's why, it's not in this story, but in some stories I've had queer villains. I've had queer heroes. I think the trick is to have that wide range, because, some people will talk about something being a offensive stereotype. And sometimes that makes me feel a little uncomfortable, just because I happen to be a very effeminate gay man.
Of course. Yeah.
So I'm like, I kind of am the stereotype. So when people call it offensive, but like, I get what they're saying is, when you don't have anything else, you only show that one type of gay man. And then, sometimes I feel like it almost goes in the opposite end, where it's all you're going to see is the straight acting gay man, because that's what they think is going to make the audience more comfortable. So I think the secret is to show the whole wide range that's out there in the queer community, and that will, I feel like, start to make things feel like it's on more equal ground.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's something that has taken a long time to take root, it seems, in popular media here in the UK. There's a phenomena here with, like, our soap operas, which are really entrenched in culture. They're very sort of important in sort of popular entertainment, and they're often sort of like lagging behind about a decade behind where culture's at in terms of what's actually happening. So when you get queer characters, they are always very, very, very particular prescribed archetypes. It's a way of almost like sanitizing what it means to be gay or trans or whatever particular demographic you happen to be. So the archetypes you find in our soap operas is you get the almost like the safe queer, the one who is recognizable and therefore is almost rendered toothless by that. And then you get those who are self-hating and closeted and destroy everything around them and then disappear out of almost out of shame, and that's it. That's almost exclusively it. There is nothing in between those two poles. It's really, really strange, considering that this is our popular media. Hundreds of thousands of people tune in to watch these damn things like on almost daily basis, and are therefore deriving particular assumptions and ideas from them about cultural demographics and what's happening in culture. But they are so narrow in their prescriptions and their representations. It just, it's bizarre to me. It's absolute, especially when you consider that at the moment the UK is a really strange place at the moment. We're obviously in the wave of this incredible rising transphobia, which is being used as a wedge to attack LGBTQ people in general, obviously, because that's what it's for. But at the same time, on the other side, we are having this situation where there are entire generations, younger generations mostly, who don't understand that phenomena because they have friends and family members and teachers who are queer, who are trans, who are gay, who are whatever, and it's like there is this incredible abyss, this cultural friction happening between these forces of what Hunter S. Thompson would have termed the old and the evil, quite rightly, quite frankly, and the younger generations. It's really, really bizarre.
In America, it's very similar. I mean, even right down to the soap operas. I can remember a soap opera that my mother used to watch took place in the fashion industry. And I would watch it and think, like, so this would have me believe the fashion industry is run by white heterosexual men. Like that's what I'm learning. But
right.
But yeah, and then I see so much. I mean, here the transphobia is just off the charts as well. And there's so much with the book banning in certain states here.
I mean,
they
I
want to
may
ban.
be wrong, but from the outside, it seems that the big difference is it seems from the outside that it's more sort of like actively extreme in the US. I've seen instances of like Nazis turning up to drag shows and whatnot. It's like, what the fuck? What the fuck? Here it's more like it's very British in the sense that it's legislative, we're too cowardly and too demurring to do anything active, even when people have a very strong bias or prejudice. So they're trying to legislate against trans people. They're trying to sort of like it's a backdoor genocide because that's what British people do,
Well, yeah, we're doing that too. But we are a nation of men who think they're cowboys.
Yeah.
Who want to show up and assert their macho-ness, and it's and there is the weird dichotomy because the younger generation has grown up with much more representation. They have grown up with much more visibility in the media.
Mm-hmm.
They've grown up with gay, straight student alliances in their schools. So sometimes it's hard for them. Sometimes I worry they don't understand the seriousness of the threat because they don't have the historical context. My husband and I were talking the other day. We were watching something that was talking about that moment in America when Ellen DeGeneres came out and then her sitcom character came out.
Yeah.
And it was the first time in this country's history there was a lead gay character on that kind of a show.
Wow.
And we remember how monumental that felt to us at the time. Because there was no representation. Like now you can find almost any ensemble show will have at least a gay character or two.
Mm-hmm. Even children's media, of course, now.
Yeah. But back then there was nothing, so it was amazing. Mm-hmm. But then there was this huge backlash. I mean, it was a very innocuous sitcom, but it would have parental advisory warnings on it. And I mean, it was just people were protesting and I mean, it was just crazy. But like, people they just know Ellen as the talk show host that everyone loved.
Right, of course.
They don't remember. I was even talking about, I remember when I was in college, there's an American singer named Melissa Etheridge.
Mm-hmm.
And she came out as a lesbian. And it was kind of a big thing because, again, back then, you didn't have a lot of out gay people in the entertainment industry.
Right.
But I've seen some younger people who have listened to her music and they don't even know she's a lesbian.
Right. That's fascinating.
So she went through a lot in order to like sort of be groundbreaking. Mm-hmm. And now the younger queer people don't even know about it.
Yeah, I mean that is part of the problem, isn't it? It's part of the problem of not having it. I mean, it's good that they haven't experienced those tensions and those problems, but at the same time, it does tend to breed a certain complacency, doesn't it? Or rather, a lack of a kind of a lack of knowledge of what it was like before, what people had to go through before to reach that point. And as a result, there's a degree of complacency with regards to how easily it could turn back. And we're seeing it now, of course. We're seeing it now. If we're not careful, if we don't stand up and fight this rising wave of what is currently transphobia primarily, but that door is already starting to wedge open even wider, and it's not going to be very long before they start going after all LGBTQ people again. Of course they will. That's the point, right? That's part of what it is. And people like J.K. Rowling and whatnot, who are just imbeciles in many respects. I mean, they are useful dupes in many respects. Their apparent sincere concerns quote unquote, that they hide behind. They allow for the rise of something way, way more unpleasant. You know, these sincere concerns are the camouflage for the Nazism that comes later, the fascism that comes later. You know. And whether they see that or not, I'm not entirely sure. It's very difficult to speak to intentionality in that regard, isn't it? With Rowling, I can never tell. I can never tell to what degree she is just not very clever, not very considered, and to what degree she is an out-and-out monster. It's very, very difficult to tell. I'm erring more towards the latter these days, considering who she's throwing her oar in with, you know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the thing. I feel like with Rowling in particular, she started out almost just dipping her toes in the water of it.
Yeah.
And she just gets more vehement and hateful with it.
Yeah.
But I feel like, you know, they say it's about sex and they don't want their kids to learn about sex. But when you try to get them to pinpoint, none of these books have actual sex in them. It's like, this book has 2 fathers in it.
Yeah, right.
Well, if that's teaching your kids about sex, then any kid's book with a mother and a father is about sex.
Anything that references marriage, anything that references relationships, anything that references any dynamic between 2 human beings that is in any way intimate, you know, is sex then on that same basis. And of course, I don't give them the benefit of the doubt in this regard. They know that that's not the point. They know that it's not about sex. They just don't like the acknowledgement that queer people exist. That's the point, you know. And this bullshit about, you know, they somehow they proclaim to believe that somehow this is going to influence people to be gay or be trans or whatever. Well, parts of them knows that that's not true. They just don't want us to be acknowledged. They don't want any cultural place for gay or queer people. And it's a way of it's like what I was talking about earlier. It's a kind of backdoor genocide. You start to erase from the ground up, from acknowledgement up, right? You don't start with the gas chambers. You don't start with the actual murders. You start by erasing people from culture and from history altogether. But I think, I mean, we may have talked about this last time, but like Barker says in Sacrament, it doesn't matter. Let's assume that the worst comes to the very worst, and there is some new hideous sort of fascist regime that arises in the UK or the US or wherever, and that it is targeted against LGBTQ people. They'll still fail. They cannot win. It is a losing battle because they're fighting humanity. They're fighting humanity. They could succeed somehow in eradicating every queer human being on the planet, and it still wouldn't work because there would be queer little babies fermenting in their heterosexual mothers' wombs at the very point as the last queer alive gasps their last breath. There will be a queer baby being born. So it's their argument. They are a death cult. Ultimately, they're a death cult. They're an extinctionist cult. The only way of stopping queerness is by eradicating humanity. So good luck with that.
I definitely agree with that because their ultimate wish is that we would not exist.
Yeah.
And I feel like they preferred the time period where we were at least hidden so they could pretend we didn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's because I feel like they are actually smart enough to recognize one of the things that led to so much progress so quickly was when we started becoming visible in media, in movies and TV shows and books. And it brought us into the lives of people who didn't think they knew any gay people and didn't think they wanted to know any gay people. And I feel like there was a real power in that. And I think they recognize that, which is why they are attacking the media first. Like, let's get them out of sight again, so we can force them back underground.
There's a horrible sort of like parochial politeness to it, isn't there? It's almost as though they regard us as indicative as a kind of a cultural decay or of a cultural disease, and therefore looking at us or having to acknowledge our existence is somehow discomforting to them. And it's fucking tough, isn't it? You know, it's like every other prejudice. We don't owe you comfort.
Yeah.
The reality doesn't owe you comfort, you know?
That's why, I have a problem with people who say, like, you need to approach them in a more gentle manner. I'm like, no,
Oh, I
like,
hate
why?
that. Oh,
Like,
I hate that.
I don't have to try to convince, like, I feel like it's a weird kind of gaslighting
Yeah,
to tell gay people we need to be nicer to the people who want to basically destroy us. And
that's it.
then they say, well, then it gives them justification. I'm like,
They don't need justification. They already have, they don't need justification. They want to do it anyway. And it doesn't matter how politely we approach them or try to pacify them or whatever, or accommodate them. It's never going to work because they want us dead. That's what the finger waggers, the ones who come to us all didactic, wagging their fingers and telling us to be polite and courteous, and that we're somehow engaging in negative representation by being, there's that awful word, shrill or combative. No, we are defending ourselves against movements and ideologies that want us dead. You don't sit down at the table with someone who wants to kill you. I'm really sorry, you don't.
exactly. And if I gave them the benefit of the doubt in what they think, then I'm like, so you would only feel like I have a right to exist if I'm nice to you.
Exactly.
That's not what gives me my rights. Is I don't have to be nice to you.
Nope.
And I don't know. I can't stand the passivity that some people think we should have when we are faced with it. And because I can't tell you how many times people will tell me, like, well, you just have different political opinions. I'm like, no, my existence is not a political issue.
Right, exactly that. And exactly that.
And if you don't think I have the basic right to exist and have equal rights, then I don't actually care what your political views are.
But no, I know exactly what you mean, and it's something that works really well in Septic, actually. What I really liked about it is the way it is massively entertaining, because you have like the multiple, the tension of the multiple perspectives. Once the initial situation is established, where Carl is locked in the bathroom and he has appendicitis, which you kind of know as the reader, you have an idea that that's where it's going to go. You have that wonderful sort of escalating tension as you hop from head to head to head, and the characters are going about their day, unaware, blissfully unaware that anything is happening, and it's that wonderful thing where you are urging them to realize you're trying to figure out how the characters are going to realize that this is happening, and of course wondering, are they going to realize? Is this going to be a very, 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 very dark story indeed? I mean, I honestly didn't know where it was going to go up until a particular point. I didn't know if it was going to be a very, very tragic story or what. I'm kind of glad it wasn't, I'm glad it wasn't. I like the reconciliation that occurs at the end, and the revelations that occur as a result of that. I mean, you can sort of see Carl and Zach going off after this, and actually having a relationship, which is a lovely idea, But there was a point where I was thinking, oh, good God, is this going to end where he's found, and he's not alive, or something hideous has happened to him?
Well, I'm glad it kept you guessing, because, anybody who's familiar with my work will know that sometimes there's a happy ending and sometimes there is not. So go into every one of them not knowing. But But it was fun for me to craft that kind of a story. And I will admit, sometimes I'm not even 100% sure which kind of ending it's going to have. I like to get things started and see how it develops. And I had a particularly good time with this one, setting up the different attempts to get out, the situations that were happening with the people outside. And it was just a lot of fun, and I did have a lot of fun exploring the queer nature of the characters, because I've known people, even well-meaning people, who say things like, well, that's fine, but I don't like it when it's shoehorned into a story where it's not organic. And I'm like, it's always organic because we're everywhere.
Right, yeah. And also, it's from our perspective, isn't it? It's from our, we are queer writers, so that's our experience. It's not shoehorned in because that's what we are, Even
when you don't, and like with this story particularly set when it was, I mean, we're there even when you don't know we're there.
Mm-hmm.
And we're dealing with things that you don't know about. And I'm reflect that. And, oddly, it goes back to that thing we were watching about Ellen DeGeneres and her sitcom. But the thing that the network executive was complaining about Ellen's sitcom, that it just became where the character was gay every week. And I'm like, well, yeah.
Well,
when you're gay every day. So, like,
yeah.
But they don't think like, oh, well, this sitcom about a married couple, it's about them being heterosexual every week.
Right. Of course they don't. Because for them, it's almost
that when
they don't see it, do they? It's so pervasive. That kind of heteronormativity is so culturally enshrined and pervasive in every aspect of media that they don't see it, even when it is actually heavily sexualized,
Yeah.
And that's the other thing that I find bizarre about that particular complaint, that just the inclusion of someone who happens to be gay or queer or whatnot is inherently somehow sexualized. When you look at straight media, so much of it actually is sexualized, even that which is aimed at children.
I mean, they were making that point of, the Ellen sitcom had the parental advisory warnings put on them, even though there was nothing sexual happening in them.
Right.
But, sitcoms with heterosexual characters of the same time.
But yes, I mean, one of the things I loved about Septic was the mother figure, the single mother, which, of course, like, this being set in the 1980s, she herself is a marginalized demographic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. I was raised by a single mother, and I definitely saw that sort of prejudice against. I don't. It's kind of weird to think, even though it was in my lifetime, some of that seems so distant and crazy now.
Absolutely. I mean, I was reading this, and like the way she's treated at work, for example, it's a time capsule, it's an archaism. It doesn't, I mean, it wouldn't occur that way now.
Yeah.
That's for damn sure. Certainly not without multiple myriad lawsuits occurring.
Yeah.
But probably was the norm for many women who were working in those environments, right?
Oh, I mean, definitely. Like I said, I saw it with my own mother. So, that just seems sort of natural to work into the story that way.
Yeah.
Because it felt very real to what I remember from that time period.
I really liked the compromises she makes in her own mind, She knows that she's kind of being abused at her job. She knows that. But she's balancing it in her mind with, well, we need to survive. I need to provide for my child, who's already been through quite a lot with his father running off and whatnot. I really liked that. And I like the way her restraint, it only goes so far. It only goes so far, and then she does tell him to stick it.
Yeah. It definitely was something that was important for me to put in there, because I wanted even the side characters to really have their own issues and lives beyond just what was going on in the plot.
Yeah, so they're not just functionaries, yeah?
Yeah, so, and that just seemed a natural progression for that character. And, I think we all make those kind of compromises. I mean, I think there are definitely people who get into situations where they hate their jobs, they're in toxic environments, but they have to provide for their families. And
yeah. So well, in his own peculiar way, even Danny in this story, I mean, he could very easily have been sort of like a very particular stereotype or archetype, right? But you find out when it switches to him that he's actually got a degree of interiority, which is unfamiliar to that character. He doesn't always exercise it, but it's definitely there.
Danny was a character I enjoyed writing because he was one that sort of developed for me in the process of writing. And I do like to take characters who seem like, especially in something set in the 80s, like the stereotypical 80s bully, and give them more of an internal life and more of, because I do think, I do think there are some people who are just assholes.
Yeah, absolutely. There are people like that, but they are fewer and farther between, aren't they? Than most people realize.
I think there are a lot of people who have more going on than we realize, and I thought that was a lot of fun to explore too, and to show that he had this other side of himself in his own mind, and when he was hanging out with Carl, and that's a lot. I always enjoy when characters sort of do that in the writing, and I realize there's more going on with them than what just would be seen on the surface.
Absolutely, yeah, and I liked the way that it induced a kind of introspection in Carl, because he is operating almost on the fringes of this jock culture, of this very sort of hyper masculine culture, and he's not actively part of it, but he also doesn't actively engage when it, or intervene when he knows it's engaging in evil, right? And it's a nice tension. It's a really wonderful thing, especially for like someone as young as he is, to be wrestling with, and given his own position as a nascent gay man.
I think that's something a lot of gay men, especially of a certain age, can relate to, that fear of being found out that makes you not speak up when maybe you should. It makes you stay quiet when someone else, because especially if the attention is on them, then it's not going to be on me. And I do think even if you don't actively participate in it, sometimes it can really get to you just remembering, I let that happen and I didn't do anything.
Yeah. And of course, it's kind of heightened here as well, because he has a bit of a soft spot for Zach, of course.
Yeah. Well, I definitely wanted to put that whole, because there's the whole unrequited crush kind of story that, we've all read. But, maybe I thought maybe it's not as unrequited, even if he doesn't know.
It's a nice thing to see, actually, especially with sort of queer romance from this era, because more often than not, it is unrequited, or it's highly problematic, or there are all these other tensions acting upon it. It's kind of nice to see, and it works really well as a leavening agent against the tension that you've built up throughout the course of the story. When you've got all the set pieces where he's trying to escape and it's going wrong, and there just seems to be no way out of this basically tomb that he's found himself in. I mean, one of the bits I liked the most actually was when he's climbing up on the sink, trying to see if he can climb out. If there's a loose tile or something, if he can get up into the ceiling or whatever. I loved that. I thought, because I knew he wasn't. I knew that, there is not going to be a way out here. Yeah. He's either going to get saved or he isn't. It's as simple as that.
I will say, just a little bit of behind the scenes trivia. The actual cheerleader that was trapped in the bathroom when I was in high school, that is actually how she got out. She climbed up on the sink, removed the ceiling tile, and she was able to climb over the wall and beat out the tile.
Brilliant. Wow. That's, I mean, clever, right? I mean, in the midst of that panic and that hypertension, to be able to think, right, I need to get out. I need to logically think of that. That's brilliant.
But I knew that wasn't going to work for Carl. No, but that's where the idea for him trying that came from.
The other thing I really liked about Carl's situation was it was the intensity of the experience. So I mean, I have a bit of a penchant for particularly horror writers who really go for the visceral description when it comes to pain of any kind, and you really get it with Carl here.
And I was drawing. I've never had appendicitis. I have had a couple of bouts of kidney stones.
Oh,
and that is some intense pain. And that's kind of what I was drawing on for that. My memories of just how much pain I was in. I talk about at first the pain makes him throw up, because when I had kidney stones, that when I first started feeling the pain, it was so intense it would make me throw up. But then it's like the pain doesn't lessen, but it's almost like your body acclimates to it. So you're not throwing up anymore, you just have the pain. And I was pulling from all of that when I was talking about Carl and his pain.
I mean, I personally, I have not experienced either appendicitis or kidney stones, but I've come across people who have had both of them, and the agony that they describe, particularly the kidney stones. I mean, I've heard it described as like the closest men can come to experiencing what childbirth is like.
I've heard that. I still can't imagine it's as bad as having an actual human being come out of you.
No.
But it is definitely the worst pain I've ever been in my life.
It's something I fear. I'll be honest. Having heard descriptions of it, it is something I fear. And what I liked about the descriptions of his pain is, if you are at all familiar with appendicitis, then you know what he's got. You kind of know where it's going, you know. And I really liked that. I really liked that. But it's the dynamics of the characters, really, isn't it? That's what the story is all about, and it works really well. They gel really beautifully. I particularly liked the sort of bully victim tension between Danny and Zach, and the way that resolves itself.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, because to me, as a reader, I can read a book that has a great plot, but if it doesn't have great characters in it, it feels dead to me. It doesn't feel so. Like, I felt like I had a great plot, but I wanted to have interesting characters that had, different dynamics among themselves, and like I said, things going on even beyond the plot to give it life.
Yeah.
And once the Danny character started to develop more for me, I kind of envisioned that final little moment with him and Zach, not like some sort of big dramatic thing, but just almost a quiet acknowledgement that I thought was a lot of fun to get to.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's like, it has to feel real and sincere, doesn't it? Plot is often problematic in many respects, because if it acts in sort of contrary to the way characters would naturally react to one another or operate, which it often can. There are writers who are very good at plot, but not very good at writing characters, and there are writers who are opposite to that. I would always err on the side of the writers who are the opposite, who are good at character, because plot will naturally develop between whatever dynamics and tensions that are occurring, right? And here it feels very sincere. Again, it's almost like a Kingian element, where the characters feel real. They feel like they're acting naturally, and they feel like that these situations that they're finding themselves in are sincere and just natural parts of the world that they're operating in.
It's definitely my approach to plot, which is that plot should come from character. I feel like I should give my characters enough personality that when I put them in a certain situation, I'll know how they would react, and that leads the plot. Because as a reader, I can't stand when the characters are doing things that don't make sense, and it's only because the writer has this rigid plot structure in mind. So he's got to make the characters do this so the plot will continue in the way that they want, even if it doesn't seem authentic to that character. In that situation. So
I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. It's a problem that you often find in sort of fantasy fiction a lot of the time, where characters tend to be more archetypes, and they exist to serve story exclusively. So there is nothing else in them, and it robs them of a certain, I mean, it depends on the type of fiction you're going for, obviously. Like if you are writing that very high mythological fiction, then the operation of the archetypes is part of what makes that particular style of story work. But it can often be the case that the characters come off as flaccid and empty because all they are functionaries.
And I want so much more life in there too, because I always say plot is a part of story, but it's not the entirety. That's why, even though Septic is a very short novella, really, I wanted, there are little digressions into, Carl's mother thinking about, a relationship she had after his father had left.
Yeah.
Has absolutely nothing to do with the plot, but my thing is, if everything in the story only moves the plot forward, it feels artificial to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of, it robs the world of verisimilitude, doesn't it? It robs it of texture. Not everything. I mean, this is like it's almost like a creative writing class thing, isn't it? Or a critical theory thing, that everything has to exist in service of plot or of narrative. That's complete garbage. What happens if you do that is that the world loses texture, it loses dynamism, it loses something that makes it resonant and feel real to the reader.
Exactly. That has always been my approach as a reader and a writer, because it's just like in life. You may be going through a horrible family tragedy, but you still have bills to pay, and you still have work to go to, and there's things going on beyond that. So it like I said, it feels very artificial to me if everything that happens to a character is only part of the plot. I'm like, there has to be more life to them so that it feels real to me. Like you said, it helps me suspend my disbelief, because I feel like I'm just sort of peeking in on actual life happening.
Yeah, so it feels like they're living, right? So it feels like they are not just these contrived entities on the page. It feels like they're operating in their own little sphere and actually doing things. I have a particular penchant for writers who almost like do away with plot altogether and just give you it's almost like a sandbox approach to writing, where the characters interact or operate, and that is what informs whatever plot occurs. I find that very interesting as a form of writing, and far more compelling than a great deal of plotted fiction.
And, it's funny you mention that, because the novel I'm working on now is in my head sort of an experiment where I have this character in mind, and I know what happens at the beginning. He's going to make a very life-altering decision. Beyond that, once he makes that decision, he's not sure what he's going to do from there. And I'm not sure. I just want to get it started and see, based on the personality I'm developing for him, what would he do in this situation?
You see, I love that. I love that approach.
Don't have a firm plot. And, I kind of got that idea from an interview I had seen with Anne Rice, where she was talking about sometimes if she's writing a scene and if she's getting bored with the scene, she'll just have the character stand up and leave the room. Yeah. And then just see what they do when they leave the room to make it exciting to her. And I thought, what if I just did a whole novel like that?
I think that's a wonderful idea. As an experiment, I think that's great. That tends to be, quite honestly, that tends to be how I write. I'm a pantser, not a plotter,
Yeah.
It just doesn't work for me when I plot stuff out. I tend to go for an almost impressionistic approach to writing. There tends to be an image or an idea or a starting sentence, and then it elaborates from there. And that's the kind of fiction I tend to enjoy. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, there is something to be said for the exquisite plot. There really is. And when it's crafted beautifully and it plays out well and all the bits fit and everything works. I mean, it is an exquisite thing. It can be such a beautiful work of art or a beautiful engine. It's not an either or thing for me. But given the choice, I will go for the character-driven story any day of the week.
I'm definitely the same. And that's kind of how I write too. And oddly, the few books I have kind of plotted, I've plotted backwards. It's because
interesting.
it's kind of like the idea was the end.
Yeah.
And then I went backwards to say, well, what led to that end?
Yeah, where did this begin?
Yeah. But typically I start with a situation, some characters that are going to be in that situation, and then I just let them loose to see what happens.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It is almost like a chaotic approach to writing, isn't it? But also a very, I mean, it's that hideous term, organic as well.
Yeah.
It's very sort of natural, you know, and I like that. I like that. I like the notion of allowing imagination free reign and just letting it go.
I have so much fun when I write, and I feel like that's usually why, because I'm excited every day to get in here and find out what's going to happen.
Absolutely, yeah. I like the unknown element of it. You know, the stuff that Lovecraft was terrified of and warned us against, but we're often exemplified in his own writing. I think it is that Barkerian element, isn't it? Because he does that. Barker's got this thing where he just doesn't care. He just lets it go. If there's an image, a concept, an idea, if there's a particular poetic turn of phrase, he's going to follow it. He's just going to follow it throughout. You know, sometimes he'll prune it down or prune it away if it doesn't work, but by God, he is going to get it out there. And I appreciate that enormously.
Yeah, I mean, Barker, obviously, I think we discussed before, is just a huge idol of mine.
Yeah. So I consider myself an acolyte, a disciple.
Just the sheer breadth of his imagination and his dare. Like you said, he'll just go for it. Yeah. And he doesn't hold back and he doesn't care. And I love that. And even though their writing is very different, I feel very similarly toward Anne Rice.
Yeah.
Because, not every one of her books works for me, but even in the ones that don't, I'm like, she just didn't care. She was like, I'm going to do that. I don't care if other people think it's crazy. It's what I want to do. And I love that. And I love writers who, everyone works differently, and I respect that and I celebrate that. But I really respond strongly to the ones who just go into it with a certain passion and a lack of, inhibition, and just really let it all flow. I love that a lot.
Me too. I absolutely, that is probably my favorite type or style of writing, I've got to say. There's a courage to it, but there's also a kind of insouciance. It's almost like, oh, fuck you, I'm going to write whatever I like. My imagination is going to be whatever I want it to be. That's the point of it, right? We're dreaming on paper here, or dreaming on screen. What's the point of inhibiting it? Let it go. Let it go. I mean, it doesn't always work, or it often produces work that doesn't always appeal to people. I mean, my short story collections, Born in Blood, volumes 1 and 2, were written very like that. They're very sort of hallucinogenic and dreamlike and nightmare-like. And it's an either-or thing with those books. People either get them and get them hard, or they don't get them and don't get them hard, Yeah. And that's kind of the point. It's deliberately alienating, but those that it appeals to, those that it talks to, it really talks to, and I like that. I like that very much.
I do too, because the truth of the matter is, if you go out trying to please everybody, that's impossible.
Yeah.
Even the most popular writers don't please everyone. You'll find some very vocal haters out there. So it almost seems like, why even try to please everyone? Like, write the story that's going to please you, and then you're going to find other people like you. It's like, sometimes when I'll write something and they'll say, somebody will tell me, readers don't like that. And I'll say, I'm a reader and I like that.
I like it.
So it's like, you forget that just because I'm a writer doesn't mean I'm not also a reader. And I'm putting in the stuff that I like in stories. So some readers do like that you just mean you don't like that.
Exactly, that you don't like that. Yeah. And I'm of the opinion that if you're creating work of any kind of worth, it is going to alienate some people. I mean, that's almost the point. I think if you're creating work that appeals too widely, it cannot help but be compromised. It cannot help but be inert, right? There are certain demographics that you absolutely should be alienating if you're creating work of worth. I mean, I would find, for example, if I found people who are ideologically conservative responded well to my work,
Yeah.
then I'd be doing something wrong.
Yeah.
I'd be doing something terribly wrong, because it's designed to be the opposite of that.
And I can remember early on in my career when I was just starting to publish, a publisher that was not one I worked with even, telling me that, because I was so outspokenly gay, that, you're going to lose potential readers that way. And my thing is, well, those aren't readers that I want.
Exactly. Good, right? Good. It's filtering out the chaff, right? I don't want it. But even the big names were told that. Barker was told that. You can't publish Sacrament because it has a gay protagonist. People won't read it. This book is too queer. And this was at the height of his career. This was after he'd made like Hellraiser and whatnot. So and it's still there to a certain degree. I mean, the independent and small press publishing has helped a great deal with liberating publishing in general. There are so many wonderful queer voices now. I mean, just so many, and it's great. It's absolutely wonderful to see. But certainly in mainstream and the big publishing houses, it's very much still there.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, if you want to find good queer horror fiction, you go to the small press, because mainstream publishing just is not. It's still not. It doesn't see it as viable. No,
it absolutely doesn't. And that's true of lots of other demographics as well, And even when it does deign to publish, say, queer fiction, it's always queer fiction of a very prescribed kind, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's always queer fiction that's almost like accommodationist, It's stuff that the straights won't find too offensive, Yeah. And I'm like, well, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it absolutely wrong. You are presenting an idea of what it is to be queer that it does not accord with everyone's, or the vast majority of people's, experience of that identity. So,
and so I feel like as we push in the small press, as it gets more diverse, I'm hoping that will sort of bleed out eventually.
I hope so, and I think it will. I think it's almost already happening. There are voices out there that are really breaking out. People like Eric LaRocca and Hailey Piper and Paula Dash and whatnot. Laura Marrow, obviously. They're starting to make headway. They're starting to break into the mainstream, and that's kind of wonderful.
So that's why I'm always pushing more queer voices.
Yeah,
they can't. When there's so many of us raising our voices, they can't ignore us forever.
That's absolutely true. And more diversity of queer voices as well. That's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing so many different type of queer voice out there now that are often entirely idiosyncratic. They're their own bespoke phenomenon. I just love that. I absolutely love that. I mean, I recently read Paula Dash's short story collection, We Are Here to Hurt Each Other. And that's revelatory. That's an absolute phenomenon. She's another disciple of Clive Barker. And wow, her work is something else. It is absolutely stunning.
I know what you mean. I've been reading an author named J. Daniel Stone, and he writes queer fiction of a completely different ilk than I do. His is very urban, big city, underground art culture kind of.
Right.
And I tend to write what I call small town queer fiction, because that's sort of my experience, and that's something I sometimes think. I think everyone thinks of the queer people who run away from their small towns to the big city, which does happen a lot, but some of us stay in the small town.
Absolutely.
And so, but I love that, I can write my kind and he's writing his kind, and I love it because it's giving me a different perspective on, the queer experience than what I'm giving. And that's why I think I don't understand writers who see it as a competition. Because I love that there's so many different voices out there, and there's so many different ways to do it.
Likewise, and I find the notion of competition in this arena to be absolutely ridiculous anyway. You are creating your own, it's your own bespoke thing, isn't it? Every shape of imagination is different. Every expression of experience is different and unique in its own peculiar ways. So the notion of competition is redundant, you know? The only problem I have is that there's such a glut of it, of this stuff now, that I struggle to consume it all,
Yeah.
you know, to process it all. And
it was people will say, "Have you read so and so?" And I'm like, "No, but I've bought a lot of their books. I
just
haven't had the time to get to it yet."
That's happened a lot.
Because, you know, I can't, when I hear about some new author, I'm so excited I'll buy the stuff, but there's so much to read. I don't get to it, but I definitely, I love that there is so much, and that it is so diverse, and it is so, that it's getting out there, and people are making their stamp. And, you know, I don't understand, because I remember once I had a writer tell me, you know, do what you want, but don't act like you're on my level. And my response was like, well, I'm not on your level, and you're not on my level. We're all on our own levels. We're doing our own thing.
Yeah, they're different spectrums, aren't they? Exactly that. It is not a hierarchy, you know? These are not sort of established strata that we're mining through. It doesn't work like that. You know, we are doing something. We're each our own unique experiments when we sit down and write. We're doing something different from what the other person is doing. And it's just finding your audience, really, isn't it? It's finding the people with whom it chimes, you know? I mean, I find very interesting, most of my admittedly very small readership are women.
Yeah.
Which I love. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I'm so almost honored, you know, in a way, to have tapped into something that women readers respond to.
Yeah, and you know, it is about finding that audience and realizing there is a wide audience too, because I think one of the problems when I started out was that publishers underestimated how diverse the audience was.
Yes. Massively.
Because they would tell me things like, well, horror has a heterosexual male fan base. I'm like,
what garbage?
It has a wide fan base of many different types, but that just tells me that you are only serving that one fan base.
I mean, this is completely anecdotal, but I know that here in the UK, like this was during the 1980s and 1990s as well, horror, like published horror fiction, horror novels, people like Stephen King and whatnot, they were selling primarily to women.
Yeah.
Primarily to women. So it's like, what utter nonsense.
And there are, you know, I feel like there was a time they didn't recognize that there's a big queer fan base of horror.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it isn't just heterosexual men who are reading horror.
Well, clearly not, right?
Yeah, that's just who some publishers wanted to cater to.
Absolutely.
And, you know, that's your business, but don't say there's not a wider audience out there for what the rest of us are doing.
Absolutely. And because, of course, you know, up until historically very recently, that our demographic just wouldn't have been acknowledged in any kind of like survey or anything. That's the reason they believed that. But it's very clear when you look at what is happening in not just horror, but the speculative genres, right? Fantasy, science fiction, queer fiction it's efflorescing. It's predominating at the moment, you know. It's where all the interesting stuff is happening. I mean, I know that's a matter of taste, but for me personally, it seems to be where all of the more experimental, the more deviant, the more transgressive, and the more interesting stuff is happening.
And that's why I love to read diversely. And I've had people tell me, well, I don't read to educate myself on different things. And I'm like, well, that's a whole can of worms we'll open later. But
right.
Beyond the educational part, I do it because it is great reading, because there is interesting stuff happening with queer writers, with people of color, with people from other countries. I'm like, you get stuff that you might not even know you are missing until you try it. Because,
absolutely.
You know, because it's like when you get stories filtered through these perspectives that have historically been not featured you're gonna get really interesting stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it happens very often. I find these days when you go back to like really sort of what's considered to be classical fiction, if you go back and read something like Moby Dick, for example, it's a world and a history that doesn't exist anymore. It's a window into another reality where humanity was so different, and the dynamics between human beings in those very ephemeral historical cultures was so different from what we understand and preconceive now. It doesn't have to be educational per se. It's opening you up. It's exposing you to something different, to a new suite of contexts and perspectives. It's making you evolve as a human being, as an abstract entity, and that can only be a good thing. That can only be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and it, to me, makes the reading experience just that much more joyous.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that strange, like, compartmentalization as well that comes with that assumption that I don't read to educate myself. Well, it will happen when you read anyway. It's not something that, it's not separate from pleasure or from the visceral experience of reading, or the technical experience of reading. It's all one. It's all part of the same dynamic and engine. I find that the compartmentalization of I don't have this experience or I don't do this for that experience doesn't really work. It doesn't tell me anything, about what that is. It just feels like a simplification to me.
I absolutely, you're talking my language.
I always go for the holistic, the holistic experience. That's what it's about, surely. Whatever it does, it does. It doesn't need to, you don't need to come at it with agenda or with intentionality. Whatever it does, and that's it. Let it happen. Don't try to control the experience. I mean, that's where the death of enjoyment and engagement comes from.
And, I feel like that goes across the board, even beyond, like, into just like genre. Like, I know readers who say, I don't like this particular kind of genre. And I guess my thinking is, I like good storytelling, and you're going to find that in every genre.
It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true.
I've known people who will say, like, I'm a huge fan of this writer, but then they wrote a book in this genre, so I won't read it because I don't like that genre. Right. So that to me says you're not a fan of the writer, you're a fan of genre.
Yep.
And again, that's your reading experience. It's something that I don't understand. Yeah.
No, me too. I mean, I've found that some of my most joyous reading experiences have been those moments of almost self-transgression, where you pick up a work that you wouldn't normally, that's outside of your normal sphere of interest, and it really engages you. It kind of changes your preconceptions of what you want and what you enjoy. That's happened to me so many times. I think a really good example actually would be a Billy Martin, Poppy Z. Bright. He wrote a series of books called the Liquor series, which they're kind of kitchen sink dramas. There's something slightly boilerplate about them, and there's nothing supernatural in them. There's nothing abstruse or anything like that. It is just about these guys and their relationship and the kitchen they open in New Orleans, and that's it. And it's great. It's absolutely wonderful. I couldn't put those books down. I wanted them. I wanted the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one, and was sad when they ended, when they stopped.
I love that series.
Me too. Oh my God, what a series of books. Oh, and
have you read The Value of X?
Yes.
One?
Yes, I've read them all.
I love that series. I was reading them when they were originally being published, and I remember when Hurricane Katrina happened.
Yes.
I was so into those books that I actually thought, what about G-Man and Ricky?
Yeah, what about
and then I'm
G-Man
like,
and Ricky, right?
You know, they're not real, but they became that real for me that I thought like this is going to impact them.
And it kind of did in a way, because it impacted Billy so much, right? It
Yeah.
kind of ripped his heart out, didn't it? You know, it ripped out his literary heart a little bit. I mean, I know Billy has said himself that he can't do those stories anymore because they're about a New Orleans that doesn't exist anymore. It's been destroyed. You know, it's kind of the same thing with Barker and Galilee, right? Galilee it's a mix, like a lot of, you know, all of Barker's work. It's a huge cauldron of loads of different concerns, but it primarily concerned his marriage and love affair with David Emilian Armstrong, which again doesn't exist anymore. The marriage failed, of course. So, and I doubt very much we'll ever see the second Galilee book. I very much doubt that, and that's a real shame, because that book is amazing. It is. Oh my God, is it something else? Is it something else? It's so wonderful. So yeah, it's interesting how often that happens, isn't it? Like the writer changes, and therefore the fiction changes so dramatically that it becomes. In fact, Barker has done that throughout his career, of course. I mean, that exact thing you were talking about, where readers say, I like this writer when they're operating in this genre, but I didn't like this body of work. That happened to Barker when he kind of made that slow transition into more fantastical and metaphysical fiction.
And you know, I see readers sometimes take this ownership thing where they get angry. I want that writer to write this kind of story.
Oh yes.
But I think a writer should write what they want, and I see them get angry if a writer started a series but then abandons it.
Yep.
And I'm like, I understand you're invested in the story, you want to see how it ends, but I don't want a writer finishing a series just because people demand it if they don't have passion for it anymore, because then you're not going to be satisfied with it anyway.
You're absolutely right. There is this kind of upstairs downstairs thing that exists between the creator and the audience, and I can't remember which writer it was, but it may have been Neil Gaiman actually, or it may have been Terry Pratchett. They said that the audience are the audience, the readers are the readers, and if they were not that, then they'd be the writers, right? But they're not.
Yeah.
They're not. So, you know, that notion of ownership that certain sort of sub-factions of audience tend to exhibit, I find to be powerfully corrosive. I find it to be really toxic. You don't create the work. Therefore, it doesn't belong to you. I'm really sorry. The version of it that occurs in your head that means something to you, that's yours. That's absolutely yours. But the stuff that the creator or the writers are creating, it's not yours. I'm really sorry. You see it with big fandoms, like, you know, sort of the big kind of nerdy fandoms, like Star Wars. Oh my God. Yeah. Star Wars, you see. I mean, Star Wars is a really good example, of course, because you can see how the fan reaction negatively affected that series, right? You had the massive lashback against the what was it, the Last Jedi, the one that was really, really lambasted, because it actually because it kind of treated its audience with a bit of respect for a change, and they didn't like that, you know. So, and then you got that awful third film. Awful third film, which was just pandering, condescending, patting on the head, go away and be quiet nonsense, right?
You know, it's so funny you say that, because I only just recently finally saw that last film.
It's garbage, isn't it?
I was so disappointed, and I loved that second one that everyone hated.
Me too. Me too.
I even noticed, like, I loved the character of Rose.
Yeah.
And she was just, I mean, I remember that actress got driven off of Twitter. People were so nasty. And then I noticed how they gave her nothing to do in the third one.
Yeah, right. And
so
also,
I'm like,
I mean, you get all the bullshit in the third one as well. You get, somehow Palpatine returned. I mean, sincerely, fuck off. That's what you should be getting angry about. When writers treat you like idiots, when media treats you like fools or children, you know, that's when you should be angry.
And then I see people... Yeah, I see people who will say things like, well, this is the story they should have told. I'm like, well, you know what? It's not. So you got the story they told. They have a right to tell the story they want to tell. if you don't like it, then again, go write your own story.
Go write your own story. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not even that invested in Star Wars, to be honest. I'm not the biggest fan of that particular franchise. It's just not my kind of sci-fi. You know, I much prefer the kind of like Philip K. Dick, Ursula K. Le Guin stuff. But I was really pleasantly surprised by The Last Jedi. I felt that here at last is a Star Wars film that's treating its audience with respect, that's actually saying, you know what, it's time for the franchise and for the fan base to grow up a bit, for the absolutes that inform it to be brought into question. And I thought, wow, that's really, it's dangerous, and it's really brilliant for this kind of popular fiction to be doing, you know, to be almost wagging the finger at its target audience. I kind of like that. But the reaction, we want to be treated like children. We want the fully processed food shoveled down our throats. We don't want stuff that challenges us or that does something different. I tell you what, Luke Skywalker has never been as interesting as he's been in that film.
Yeah.
Never in the entire run has he been as interesting as he is in that film.
And even in the last one, that moment where they gave Chewbacca the medal because it was an answer to that whole thing about how he should have gotten one at the end of the first movie way back in the 70s.
For God's sake.
That it took me completely out of the story, because I'm like, that's like a nod and a wink, and
it's pandering, isn't it? That's what it is. It's absolute pandering, and it's pandering to the worst elements of the fan base. That's what really bothers me. To the really vocal ones who feel as though they own the franchise. That should never happen. Fiction should never be, I'm really sorry, it should never be responding to what the audience want.
Yeah.
It should, or think they want. It should be this sounds terrible, but it's true. It should be giving the audience what they need, not what they want.
Yeah.
You know?
Because sometimes what the audience want isn't what the story needs.
No.
And, Joe Lansdale is famous for saying he writes like everyone he knows is dead, because he doesn't care what story they want him to tell.
That's great. Like, I love that.
I love writers who do that, who just like, this is the story I want to tell, and you don't have to like it.
No,
but
no.
It's the story I told.
That's it. You don't have to like it at all, but you can't tell me how to tell it, and you can't tell me what shape it's going to be. But we are getting, I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's escalated massively recently, particularly within sort of like mainstream filmmaking, where you have works that are edited by test audience, Yeah. And then you get sort of like the movies being transformed during production based on what the audience feedback is. And I'm like, no, don't do that. That's bad. That's bad for the work. That is bad for the work. If you continue to do that, all you're going to get is gruel. It's going to be grey porridge, It's not going to have any flavor. It's not going to have any spice to it.
And, sometimes my favorite thing in a story is when it gives me the exact opposite of what I was hoping for.
Yes.
Because it makes it surprising. It makes it sometimes very emotional for me.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what I want to happen isn't good for the story.
Yeah.
And that's why, if you're trying to write it for what the audience wants to happen, well, the audience isn't made up necessarily of storytellers.
That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And very often not giving like the audience what they want, it creates this like you said, it creates this wonderful frisson, right? Where you are shocked out of complacency by it, and it places you in this state of vulnerability where you are suggestible, so your state of mind can be changed, which ultimately is what writers are trying to do, right? It's what artists are trying to do. We're setting up camp in other people's psyches, we're setting up territory, we're claiming territory, and we are terraforming. We want to change you. Although, I mean, I question anyone who goes into it not wanting to do that, or claiming that they don't want to do that. Well, why are you doing it then? What's the point if that's not what you want to do?
And, it's a hard business. So if you're just trying to do it to make money, you might be better off doing something else.
There are better things you could be doing if you want to make money than write. I mean, that's for damn sure. That's for damn sure.
I feel like, and writer like Anne Rice, I know, had said similar things, but I love my readers. I appreciate my readers.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not writing for the readers. I'm still writing for myself. I'm still writing the stories and that's why, I made a post about this recently. Like, I feel like you're not always supposed to admit it, but like, I'm a fan of my own work because
I saw your post. Yeah.
I'm writing the stories I would want to read.
Yeah.
So if I wasn't a fan of my own writing, then I feel like I would be doing something wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, surely that is the point, right? You're trying to bring something into the world that wasn't there before, that you feel will make the world better, something that doesn't exist yet. So it's got to be yours, and it's got to be something that you love. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are writers who were the exact opposite of that, and some of them are like, Lovecraft. Lovecraft hated his work. He absolutely hated it. I always say that if you feel bad about your work at any particular point, go and read what Lovecraft wrote about his own work. Yeah. You'll feel better. You'll feel better immediately, because there was a man, as well as having lots of other problems, loathed. He was never satisfied with his own work. He never got to where he thought he should be with it.
I think my secret is that I just kind of accept where I am. Like, I don't think about. I mean, I do want to continually improve my craft, which I think happens by doing it, and by reading other great stories. But I never think like, this is where I ultimately want to be. I'm like, I'm happy with where I am at each stage that I'm going. And now, granted, that's not very high on the ladder, but I'm happy with where I am because I'm writing stories I love.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's okay if those stories only appeal to a small number of people. If they do, they do, but they will appeal to that small number of people, and they will do the job they're supposed to for that small number of people, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. It's always wonderful if you get a wider readership. That's always wonderful. But at the same time, that kind of comes naturally as you continue, doesn't it? It just happens.
Yeah.
If you're doing the work well, if you are actually putting the effort in and whatnot, it just evolves. It happens naturally.
There's nothing to do but to keep doing it.
Yeah, keep doing it. Right. I mean, I know I've reached a point now. If I stopped, I'd be ill.
Yeah.
Like mentally ill. I'd something would snap. Something
I definitely
would go very wrong.
Don't feel like myself if I go too long without sitting down and writing.
Me too. And don't get me wrong, sometimes what comes out doesn't work, and that's fine too.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing about writing in a pantsing sort of way is sometimes I get stuck and I'm like, okay, maybe this one is going to be put aside for right now. But like, I don't consider that wasted.
No, you can come back to it. It's still all
part of the process. Yeah,
you can come back to it.
I often have, like, sometimes years later.
Yeah, likewise.
And finished it.
Likewise, I've gotten. I mean, bizarrely, because I'm tazzing about so much at the moment, I tend to write on the word processing program on my phone a lot at the moment. When an idea comes, I've got like half-finished novels on that damn phone. It's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous that I've stopped at particular points, and it hasn't come. It hasn't continued for whatever reason, but maybe it will, or maybe some idea from that story will become something else.
I've definitely cannibalized old ideas and old fragments before and incorporated them into new stories.
Likewise. And I've also done that thing where you're reading through the story and you realize that the core of it, the essence of it, is in like one page or one scene or one paragraph, and that's the story, right?
Yeah.
That's the story, and the rest is almost like, it's filler. You need to sort of prune away, almost archaeologically down to get to the essence of it.
I've taken fragments where, I had this whole novel planned and realized, like, this is a short story.
Yep.
Like, the whole thing is a short story. and written that and just been over the moon.
And the opposite, of course. I mean, I've started writing what I wanted to be short stories, and the story didn't want it. It wanted to be bigger than that. So it's like, well, okay, fine. You know, you do you.
I let the story dictate.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Because, of course, what happens when you start to put artificial constraints on it is you smother it, or you stunt its growth somehow.
Yeah, and I feel like as a reader, I can tell when a short story has been padded to be something longer, when a novel has been truncated to be something shorter. So I feel like let the story tell you how long it needs to be.
And it will let you know. I mean, it's such a strange experience, isn't it? But it will let you know. You know, and when it wants to stop and when it wants to end, it will let you know as long as you get out of your own way. There's this almost like Zen quality to it, isn't there, sometimes, where you have to, it's almost like an altered state of mind that you have to get yourself into to be receptive to it.
And you have to trust it, because there are some people who just don't like short stories, or there are some people who don't like novellas, and just, I've written novellas and had reviews where they were like, you should have trusted yourself to write a whole novel. I'm like, well, a novella isn't a novel that you just stopped writing. It's its own thing.
It's its own form.
Not everybody can appreciate it. That's the thing is, like I said, we can't please everybody. So don't try.
Don't try. That's it. Trying to please everybody with any kind of artistic endeavor is death. It will destroy the work. It will compromise it terminally. Unfortunately. Right, Mark, shall we draw that one to a close? Thank you once again for coming on to chat.
Thank you.
As always, it's a pleasure. You know, despite technical ups and downs, it balanced out towards the end there, didn't it? It seemed to sort of get better there for whatever reason. But no, thank you once again. And is there, while we're here, I mean, obviously there's your novella Septic, but is there anything else that you'd like to pimp out?
You know, one of my favorite pieces that I published last year that hasn't gotten a lot of attention is my coming-of-age queer drama, The Advantaged. I am so proud of that one, and so any chance I get to just mention it and encourage people to check it out.
Excellent. Well, guys, links below to that and all of Mark's other works as well. As for myself, you can find me knocking about here on the Exaggerated Elegy channel, where there are more podcasts like this and also Let's Plays of video games that I enjoy. If you want to read my published work, you can find links to all of them over on strangeplaygrounds.com. If you do read them, or Mark's works for that matter, reviews are always just massively appreciated by any writer, so thank you very much for that. And if you fancy chatting to me, you can come and chat to me over at Twitter on Enigmatic Elegy. Mark, thank you once again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I had a lot of fun.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you guys. Until next time, bye-bye.